Good morning again. Last week we started a sermon series on parables, calling this series Jesus the Storyteller. And while there are a number of parables to choose from, we're going to be looking in this series at some parables that are lesser known, sometimes because they just appear maybe in just one of the Gospels. It may be that Mark tells the story, but Matthew and Luke or John don't. Or in some cases they're going to be confusing or not necessarily totally obvious on the surface what they're all about, or perhaps a parable that maybe there's more to it than we have previously learned or been led to believe. So we shared the story about this fig tree and this landowner and this gardener, and we're going to come back to that here this morning. But first, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard an accounting of something, a story that when you heard it, you weren't quite sure that you believed it, but because of the subject matter or who it was about, and if you really admired that person, you wanted to believe it? There's something in you that said, I'm not sure I believe that, but because I want to believe it, I'm going to take it as truth. Or the opposite. If you had a story where you heard an account of something and it sort of fit into what you wanted to believe, and maybe it was about an enemy or somebody that you have strong feelings about, disagreement about, and so you wanted to believe it even though there was something in the back of your mind that said, I'm not sure that this is legit. Well, hold on to that thought for a second. So in Jesus' time, there was a story. There was a story that there was a group of people from the region of Galilee, so somewhere around that Sea of Galilee region where Jesus is from, that's where his home base of his ministry is. It's fishing communities, small villages around that area. And there was a group of these people who were making one of their regular pilgrimages down to the holy city of Jerusalem, and they were going to the temple and they were going to offer sacrifices there. Maybe they were sacrificing a lamb, maybe it was going to be a dove, we don't know. But there was this story that there was a group of Galileans who went to Jerusalem, they went to make a sacrifice, and something went wrong. The legend goes that Pontius Pilate ordered that some of the Roman soldiers kill those Galileans who were attempting to make the sacrifice. And when those people were killed, their blood mingled with the blood of the animal sacrifice on the holy site of the temple, thereby doing something that was deemed to be horribly wrong, right? This grave injustice had been done to these people who were just there to worship and to live out their commands to be faithful Jewish people. And in the process, they desecrated this holy site with their own blood, and it mingled with the blood of the animal sacrifices. Now, interestingly, there's no accounting for this event happening in any of our historical sources. In fact, the only record of this that we can seem to find is that it's in this chapter from Luke that I read to you earlier, which is the story where, if you remember how the passage began this morning, Jesus said a group of Galileans asked Jesus if he was familiar with this story about these other Galileans that had gone to Jerusalem and whose blood Pilate had mingled with that of their sacrifices. It's a story that is like an urban legend in Jesus' time. I mean, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe it's been embellished a little bit. It's hard to know. But it's interesting that Luke shares that this is how this particular parable is set up. So the story begins with these Galileans who pull Jesus aside and tell him, have you heard about this? Have you heard this scuttlebutt about what has happened in Jerusalem? And Jesus does something kind of interesting here. He takes this opportunity to talk about two very different but related things. And the first thing that he does is he says something that questions their theology. He says, "Do you think that those Galileans, as you have told me about, perished because they were greater sinners than other Galileans?" And before they have time to answer the question, Jesus says, "No." And then he cites another example. He says, you're familiar with this other story about a recent current event. There's this tower of Siloam, near the pool of Siloam, inside the walled city of Jerusalem. And so apparently there was this tower that was being constructed, and something happened during the construction, and the tower toppled, and it crushed people underneath it. And he says, do you think that those who died because they were walking by that tower as it crumbled died because they were greater sinners than anybody else? And again, before they have a chance to answer, Jesus says, no. You see, one thing that we know from many other instances in the Bible preceding this story is that people made an assumption theologically. And that was they equated bad things happening to people that deserved them, particularly when it involved mortality, right? So if somebody died, it must have been because they deserved it, or they had done something that offended God previously. Or, if we also see, maybe it was their parents or their grandparents that did something, and now the sins of the grandparents are being revisited on the grandchildren, right? So this is a common way of understanding things, because everything in a lot of people's minds theologically then and today, it has to work out. Like, it has to be math. It has to be an equation. If this weird random thing happens, there's some reason that they deserved it. And Jesus stops them when he hears them talking about this story about these pilgrims who were slaughtered with their animal sacrifices, and their blood ran together. He uses this example to say, hey, do you think that these devout people who were making a spiritual pilgrimage to offer a sacrifice to God somehow had it coming? It'd be hard to argue, knowing what we know of the story, that they deserved it. But probably people in their minds were doing theological gymnastics to try to make it work. Jesus says that's not how it works. And I'm adding on here, but basically I think what he's saying is, I know you'd like to think it works that way because it's nice if it's a tidy little thing, where if it's a cause and effect type thing. But honestly, life doesn't always work that way. And so he's correcting their theology, and there's really no other mention of that. But I think that that's a really important thing, especially for a lot of us who struggle with that or carry grief or guilt for a very long time, because it is somehow wrapped up in the notion that if this has happened, then there must have been something that was done that was the cause of that being the effect. And Jesus frees us from that kind of harmful thinking, because sometimes bad things just happen. Sometimes poor construction or a little earthquake or some other thing, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, causes a tower to topple, right? Some people who were living in San Diego this week happened to have their home hit by a plane, right? I mean, stuff just happens. But it doesn't mean that any of them were greater sinners than any one of us, or that we are superior to them because we are here this morning. And so Jesus says this, and I don't think that we should just gloss over this. This is an important point to mention. And then he goes on to say this: remember that all of us will also have our lives come to an end. And when we do, it's important beforehand for us to have an understanding and a relationship with God. And that's something that he emphasizes in this too. But he goes on to talk a little bit more in detail about something else that I think I want to spend more time on, because I think it gets at the heart of the parable. Have you come in contact with someone? You have come into contact with somebody. This is part of all of our experience. Can you think of an example, probably very quickly, of someone who enjoys or seems to enjoy being outraged about something and then pointing fingers at those involved in the thing that they are outraged about, right? If you have a social media account, you have this experience, right? And it's so easy for many people to get outraged, and they get all up in arms, and they start pointing fingers, and they start casting blame, and they want to blame it on the economy, or it's about the Muslims, or the past administration, or the current administration, or the immigrants, or whatever, like, you know. And so it's the cause of the moment, and it's the hot button thing, and people are quick to point out. And it's like liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, independent, everybody does it. Everybody does it. Everybody is hot to jump on the bandwagon, and this is what I'm talking about, of the thing that we are quick to take something and jump on it if we agree with it, or condemn it if we disagree with it, and we get real quick about jumping into our corner with the people that we agree with or think like us, and we want to be outraged about things, and we want to condemn, and we want to point our fingers about the things. And so we have a story where Jesus leads in, these Galileans lead in, and they say, "Have you heard about these Galileans, these neighbors of ours?" And Jesus is probably like, "Do you know any of them?" I'm like, no, we just heard it happen. And they went down to Jerusalem, and then big bad Pilate killed them, and their blood ran together with the other blood. And it's like, well, have you heard back? Do you know any of these families? Well, no. But we know that it happened because that's just the kind of stuff that Pilate does, right? And so this is, I think, how this story starts out. And Jesus says to them, "Hey, pump the brakes for just a second." And for us, I think that this story rings true because we still see the same kind of thing. We jump on these urban legends, we get outraged, we point our fingers. And even if we are the ones who say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Look at all these fools that are pointing their fingers and jumping to conclusions and getting on their high horse and getting outraged," and then we get outraged at the outraged, and then we point our fingers at them, and then we just perpetuate this cycle. And so Jesus tells this story. This is all the setup for this story. Because then he tells the story of the fig tree. And the story of the fig tree on its own, it sort of makes sense. The landowner comes in after 3 years' time of looking at this empty fig tree, says to the gardener, "Cut it down. It's taking up space. It's effectively doing nothing for us. Get it gone. Let's plant something else in this spot." And the gardener says, "Let's give it one more year. I'm going to dig around it. I'm going to fertilize it. And if nothing happens in a year, okay, we'll cut it down." When I think about all that's going on in this story, it makes me think of some of my own experiences with planting trees. Now, we have a puny little fig tree. If Stephen's fig tree has got 1,000 figs, good for him. Mine maybe has one. Because it's about yay big, and we planted it a few years ago, and maybe it's not in the right spot, but it is not doing a thing. So I thought immediately of my own fig tree, and it may meet the axe soon. Actually, I could probably cut it down with the scissors at this point. But when I have planted trees before, and for any of you who have planted a tree that's probably at least 6 feet or taller, what happens is you get home, and it's in the plastic pot, right? In the flimsy little plastic pot where it has been growing. And you have to take the pot off the bottom. And sometimes that pot doesn't even come off very easily because it is so root bound in there. And so you have to cut the pot off with a gardening scissors of some kind or a utility knife. And you cut that off, and then it's this giant root ball, right? For any of you who have done this, you can picture this. It's covered with these white and kind of yellow roots. And then what you have to do is you have to get your hands in there and you have to mess up the roots, and you kind of have to shake them loose because they have wound themselves so tightly together that it is almost like it is choking itself off at the bottom. And so you got to break it up a little bit. You got to loosen it. And then you got to plant it in the ground. And you got to get in there and you got to put your spade or your shovel in the ground, and you got to chop up around it. You got to loosen up the soil around there, because if you just dig a hole the right side to plant the tree in, then it's going to hit the side walls of the hole that you just built, and it's not going to go anywhere. And I don't know if your soil is like the soil that's in the backyard of the parsonage, but on one side of the yard, I can put the shovel in, especially after it's been raining, and turn over the earth. On the other side, it's such compacted clay that I got to use a pickaxe, like literally a pickaxe to dig a hole this deep. It's basically like digging into rock. And especially in that area, if I don't break up an area much larger in circumference than the actual size of the root ball, it's never going to grow because it's only going to stay that big. I'm curious about this puny little fig tree that I've got. If I dug down there, if that's part of the problem, is that it has never been able to actually branch out at all. And so Jesus tells this story. But again, remember, it's right after this critique of the individuals who he has basically said, you are so worked up about pointing your finger at Pilate and the Romans, and you have become whipped into a frenzy about what you perceive as an injustice that has been done that you can't actually provide any factual backing for, but it just fits your narrative, it fits your agenda. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but you've become so singularly focused on this that when you sit in my presence and I am teaching you these things as the Messiah, that the thing that you can't wait to tell me about is this injustice that you perceive that has been done against some of your neighbors. And it falls into that narrative trap again of we want Jesus who we want Jesus to be. This is one of the classic examples of these people encounter Jesus, and what they want him to do is to be the one to redeem Israel, not for one's salvation, not for mercy and grace, but to take their people and their place back from the empire of Rome. And so they want Jesus to fix that problem for them, and so they are citing the things that has whipped everybody else up into a tizzy by citing the latest event that supposedly has taken place in the holy city, and they cite that as a reason for Jesus to take up his sword and lead the charge against the Romans. And what Jesus instead says to them is, you guys are just taking up space. I hear your complaint, but I don't see you bearing any fruit. I see you being outraged and finger pointing, but I don't see you really doing anything to advance the cause of your neighbor. And I see you feeling very self-righteous about your anger. And I'm wondering how you have showed that you are devoted to a life as a servant of God. And so he says to them, essentially, you've gotten real worked up about the sins of somebody else. Maybe it's time you took a look at yourself. Or the other passage that comes to mind, of course, is from Matthew 7. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but you do not notice the log in your own eye? How can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is still in your own eye? I think this is sort of the same kind of idea that Jesus is talking about here. And now when we understand that this is the setup, or this is the backdrop for this parable of the fig tree, now it's not just about have a life that bears fruit. It's a critique of the way that they and us spend a lot of our energy and a lot of our emotion and a lot of our time being outraged and taking up space, but not bearing any fruit in the process. And what Jesus is saying is that many of us have become so preoccupied and concerned about the wrongdoing and the sins of others that we have become root-bound. We've become hardened. And we are not blooming and sprouting and growing and spreading maybe like we should be. And then he says this. He says, after the gardener offers to break up the ground around it, in other words, soften the ground around it, he then talks about the adding of the fertilizer or of the manure. Now I'm going to take an editorial liberty here. But if you've ever spent any time on a farm, or if you have an above average sized dog, you'll know what they are capable of producing on your property. And if you are to collect all of that waste, and you are to put it in a waste pile in the corner of the yard, you know what happens, right? Nothing. It steams, it stinks, and it's going to burn a hole in your grass. And the only way to properly get rid of that is to start to mix it and to break it down and to spread it. But if you just set it to the side and let it fester, it's going to do nothing but continue to be a problem. And it's probably going to make things worse because you're going to make a toxic pile that you can't do anything with that ground for a long time afterwards. And there's part of me where I hear Jesus saying, if you want to get right with me, you're going to need to address your own waste. And when that waste is sprinkled and added and mixed in, and you've properly dealt with it, well then, you can grow from that. You can learn from that. Heck, that might even be a boost to you. But what you can't do is set it to the side and keep it in a pile and pretend that that's not going to be a problem for later. And so I think that there's a message in here too, beyond just we should bear fruit as Christians, right? That's a great message for the kids to talk about. But I think that there's something deeper in here too, which is that this parable begins with a critique of people who were religious, faithful people. And Jesus' critique of them is saying, you are spending an awful lot of your time pointing fingers, judging, and being outraged. And maybe we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about how we can be softened, how we can deal with our own refuse, and how that might actually provide the kind of groundwork for us to grow and thrive as we need to be. Because we don't need to be the kinds of Christians that take up space. We need to be the kind that are dealing with stuff in a healthy way, working through that, and finding ways to bear fruit in a way that shares a message of hope and not just condemnation. To one that talks about, look, it's important to point out injustices and to be on the right side of things and to work for peace and justice and all that. That is wonderful, but it also means that in order to do that, you need to be a spiritually healthy person yourself. In spiritual health, the easy way, or the short-circuiting of that, the cheap way of doing that, which doesn't really end in anything good, is the way of outrage and finger-pointing and getting on your moral high horse. So when we look at this, Jesus is talking about every one of us needs to repent. But he's not talking about that in some kind of, evangelical jargon like it's a magic spell kind of a thing. He's talking about it more like we need to try to fix our relationship with God and with our neighbors. To repent, again, means to turn away from, to do a 180 from. And so if we find ourselves slipping into this path, the 180 in the other direction is the way that we need to be going. And Jesus is saying we want to have that kind of fruit-bearing life, that we need to tend to the soil. We need to talk about the foundation of what we are in. We need to talk about the perspectives that we have and the way we lead our lives and the softening and the fertilizing and all of those things so that we can truly thrive and become the kind of people that Christ invites us to be. So many of these parables, they seem so simple on the surface. But with a little bit more of the backstory, you see the richness of what Jesus is talking about. And a message that is as pertinent for us today as it was when he shared this 2,000 years ago. So my prayer today is that all of us might enter into these parables yet again, to hear them in a new kind of way, and to think about, especially when we rush to judgment, when we are quick to critique, when we find ourselves, always just on the verge of outrage, to pause, to reflect on what it is that is causing this trouble within us, and to proceed in a way that says, is this the kind of appropriate response that will bear fruit, that will further the kingdom, and that will care for my neighbor as I care for the way that God sees me as a child? Will you pray with me?